Welcome, gentle listeners, to Educational Bedtime. If you find peace in these historical journeys, consider subscribing for more stories that guide you softly into rest. Tonight, we venture into the shadowed corridors of medieval monasteries, where stone walls held secrets of survival, sacrifice, and surprising contradictions. Imagine stepping through heavy wooden doors into a world where silence was not just golden, it was law, where comfort was considered sin, and where the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment demanded the surrender of everything we consider essential to human happiness. These weren't just religious communities, they were complex societies with their own brutal hierarchies, hidden luxuries, and devastating hardships that would challenge even the strongest among us. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore why most people wouldn't survive even a week behind monastery walls, meet a peasant monk who became one of the most powerful men in medieval France, uncover the mystery of priceless manuscripts lost to time, and discover how some religious leaders lived in shocking luxury while their brothers suffered in sacred poverty. Let your breathing slow as we begin this journey into the past, where the rhythm of prayer bells marked time, and survival meant learning an entirely different way to be human. Chapter 1. Why You Wouldn't Last a Week in a Medieval Monastery. The bell pierces the darkness at 2:30 in the morning. Not a gentle chime, but a harsh, insistent clanging that jolts you from whatever fitful sleep you managed on your straw mattress. Your feet hit the cold stone floor of your cell, a space barely 6 feet by 8 feet, containing nothing but that thin mattress, a wooden stool, and a single candle stub that's almost burned away. Imagine yourself stumbling in the darkness, your breath visible in the frigid air. There's no time to gather your thoughts or stretch the aches from your body. The bell means one thing: matins. The first of 8 prayer services that will punctuate your day like clockwork, whether you're ready or not. You shuffle through narrow corridors with dozens of other figures, their faces gaunt shadows in the flickering torchlight. The chapel awaits, a vast stone cavern that seems to swallow warmth itself. You'll kneel on these stones for the next hour and a half, your knees gradually going numb, your back screaming in protest, while Latin prayers echo endlessly around you. This is just the beginning of your day. The stone floor beneath your knees has been worn smooth by centuries of genuflecting monks, each generation adding to the polished surface through countless hours of prayer. The cold seeps through your woolen habit, which provides little insulation against the mountain air that flows freely through the unglazed windows. Your fellow monks kneel in perfect rows, their heads bowed in identical submission, but you can hear the subtle sounds of suffering, quiet gasps of pain, the shifting of weight from one aching knee to another, the suppressed coughs of brothers fighting the chest ailments that plague monastic communities. By the time Lord's ends around 4 in the morning, your stomach is already cramping with hunger. But there's no breakfast waiting. Not yet. First comes reading time, where you huddle in the scriptorium, trying to make sense of religious text by candlelight, your fingers so cold they can barely turn the pages. The great silence has begun, the period when speaking is absolutely forbidden except in the most dire emergencies. You quickly discover that silence isn't peaceful, it's oppressive. Every cough, every shuffle of feet, every rumble of your empty stomach seems to echo like thunder. You watch other monks communicate through an elaborate system of hand gestures, but you don't know the language yet. You're isolated in a crowd, desperate to ask questions, but forbidden to speak. The weight of unspoken words builds in your throat, creating a psychological pressure that adds to your physical discomfort. The scriptorium itself tells a story of dedicated preservation mixed with human suffering. Long wooden tables bear the scars of decades of use, ink stains that have soaked deep into the grain, scratches from countless quills and styluses. The manuscripts you're expected to study are written in Latin that assumes years of education you've never received, religious concepts that require theological training to comprehend, philosophical arguments that would challenge educated scholars, yet you're expected to absorb and internalize these ideas while your body weakens from hunger and cold. The sun finally rises around 6, and with it comes prime. Another hour of kneeling prayer. By now your knees are raw, your back is seizing, and you're lightheaded from hunger, but still no food. Instead, you're assigned to the kitchens for manual labor, hauling water from wells that may be hundreds of yards from the main buildings. scrubbing massive iron pots with coarse sand that tears at your already tender hands, hauling sacks of grain that seem impossibly heavy on your weakened frame. The work is backbreaking, but it serves a dual purpose, keeping the monastery running and breaking your individual will. Every task is designed to remind you that you are nothing. Your desires, your comfort, your very sense of self must be surrendered completely. The kitchen work begins before dawn and continues long after dark, an endless cycle of preparation, cooking, cleaning that never truly ends. You learn to move efficiently despite exhaustion, to anticipate the needs of your supervisors without being asked, to find small ways to ease the burden on your fellow workers without drawing attention to yourself. The monastery's daily routine follows the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and refined over hundreds of years of practical application. 8 prayer services mark the passage of time: Matins at 2:30 a.m., Lauds at dawn, Prime at 6 a.m., Terce at 9 a.m., Sext at noon, None at 3 p.m., Vespers at sunset, and Compline before sleep. Between these services, every moment is accounted for: manual labor, study, meditation, meals, even sleep is regulated, with precise hours allocated for rest that never feel sufficient for bodies pushed to their limits. When the breakfast bell finally rings around 8, you rush to the refectory with desperate anticipation. But what awaits you would barely qualify as food by modern standards. A thick slice of coarse brown bread, made from whatever grain was cheapest, often mixed with sawdust or ground acorns to stretch the stores. The bread is dense and difficult to digest, requiring careful chewing to avoid choking on the rough texture. A bowl of thin gruel, perhaps with a few vegetables floating in watery broth, that provides minimal nutritional value. An ale, weak, sour ale, that's safer to drink than the water, but does little to nourish your increasingly frail body. You eat in silence, of course. One monk reads aloud from scripture while the rest of you focus on your meager portions. No talking, no laughing, no human connection. Just the mechanical act of consuming barely enough calories to keep your body functioning. The reading continues throughout the meal. Passages about spiritual discipline and the rewards of suffering that seem to mock your current physical state. You learn to eat slowly, making each bite last as long as possible, both to aid digestion and to extend the brief respite from labor. And this is your best meal of the day. The refectory itself reinforces the monastery's hierarchy through its very architecture. Common monks sit at long wooden tables on backless benches that offer no comfort. The abbot and senior officials occupy a raised platform at the head of the hall, their chairs cushioned, their portions more generous, their service more attentive. You can see the difference in quality between what's served to the leadership and what reaches the common tables, but commenting on such disparities would be considered a serious breach of discipline. The hours that follow blur together in a haze of exhaustion and hunger. More prayers. Terce at 9, Sext at noon, None at 3, between each service. More manual labor. Copying manuscripts until your hand cramps and your eyes water from strain. Working in gardens with primitive tools that require twice the effort of modern implements. Cleaning endless stone surfaces that never seem to get truly clean, no matter how much scrubbing you apply. The repetitive nature of these tasks creates a meditative quality for some monks, but for newcomers they represent an endless cycle of physical punishment that wears down both body and spirit. The manuscript copying work deserves particular attention, as it reveals both the monastery's cultural importance and the individual monk's suffering. You're given a quill pen that must be constantly resharpened, ink that freezes in winter and becomes too thick to use properly, a parchment that's expensive enough that mistakes cannot be tolerated. The texts you copy are often in languages you don't fully understand, theological treatises that require years of study to comprehend, historical chronicles that assume knowledge you've never acquired. The work demands perfect concentration despite hunger, cold, and fatigue that makes steady hands nearly impossible to maintain. Your dinner, served in late afternoon, consists of more bread and gruel, perhaps with a thin soup if you're fortunate. Meat is a luxury reserved for feast days and the infirm. Maybe a few times a year you might taste a small piece of fish or a bit of bacon. Mostly, you subsist on carbohydrates and whatever vegetables the monastery gardens can produce. The evening meal is even more sparse than breakfast, designed to ensure that monks go to bed with empty stomachs that won't distract them from nighttime prayers and meditation. The monastery's agricultural system provides some insight into medieval nutrition and the deliberate deprivation imposed on religious communities. Gardens produce cabbage, onions, leeks, beans, and other hardy vegetables that can survive in harsh climates. Orchards provide apples and pears when the harvest is good, but fruit is often reserved for the sick or sold to generate income for the monastery. The bread that forms the foundation of every meal comes from grain grown on monastery lands, but the best portions are sold at market, while monks consume what remains, a deliberate choice that prioritizes institutional wealth over individual nourishment. As winter approaches, the cold becomes a constant companion. There's no heating in your cell, no warm clothing beyond your rough woolen habit. You sleep in the same robes you wear all day, adding perhaps a thin blanket when the frost begins to form on the inside of your cell walls. Many nights you wake with your water basin frozen solid, ice crystals forming on the stone walls around your sleeping area. The cold affects every aspect of daily life, from the difficulty of holding a pen to copy manuscripts to the challenge of performing manual labor with stiff, numb fingers. The cold affects more than just your comfort. It saps your strength, makes you vulnerable to the diseases that sweep regularly through monastery populations. Pneumonia, consumption, and various fevers claim monks regularly, particularly during the harsh winter months when malnutrition weakens immune systems. You watch brothers disappear into the infirmary, their harsh coughs echoing through the corridors, and wonder when your turn might come. The infirmary itself offers little relief, with treatments based on medieval medical knowledge that often does more harm than good. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of monastic life isn't the physical hardship. It's the complete annihilation of your identity. You surrender your name, taking on a new religious designation that severs your connection to family and past. Your personal possessions are distributed or destroyed, eliminating the material anchors that once defined your place in the world. Even your thoughts are monitored and corrected, with senior monks watching constantly for signs of pride, individuality, or resistance to the monastery's absolute authority. Speak out of turn, miss a prayer service, show reluctance in your work, or display any behavior deemed insufficiently humble, and punishment arrives swiftly. Public flogging in the chapter house, where your fellow monks are forced to watch as leather straps mark your back. Days or weeks of bread and water rations that push your already weakened body closer to collapse. Solitary confinement in dark cells where the silence becomes truly maddening, and the lack of human contact creates psychological damage that can last for years. Some punishments are more subtle, but equally devastating. Extra manual labor during your precious few hours of rest. Assignments that extend your working day well beyond what others endure. Permanent assignment to the most degrading tasks, cleaning latrines, handling the dead, tending to the sick and diseased in conditions that almost guarantee infection. Social isolation within an already isolated community, where even the minimal human contact of shared meals is withdrawn, leaving you to eat alone while others enjoy what little fellowship the monastery allows. The chapter house meetings where discipline is administered follow a formal ritual that emphasizes both the monk's powerlessness and the institution's absolute authority. Accusations are read aloud. The accused monk must confess his failings publicly, and the assembled community watches as punishment is administered. These sessions serve multiple purposes, deterring others from similar infractions, reinforcing the hierarchy that governs monastery life, and creating a climate of fear that discourages questioning or resistance. You begin to understand why so many novices fled in their first year. The historical records show that for every monk who persevered, 3 or 4 others escaped back to the secular world, choosing poverty and uncertainty over the systematic destruction of everything that made them human. The monastery walls are high and the gates are locked, but determined individuals find ways to escape, scaling walls at night, bribing guards, or simply walking away during outside work assignments and never returning. Those who stayed often broke in different ways. Some became fanatics, embracing the suffering with an intensity that frightened even their brothers, turning their physical pain into a form of spiritual ecstasy that bordered on madness. Others retreated so far into themselves that they became virtual ghosts, going through the motions of monastic life while their spirits withered away. performing their duties mechanically while their minds escaped to memories of life before the monastery or fantasies of freedom they knew they would never achieve. A few found genuine spiritual fulfillment in the surrender, but they were rare exceptions to the general pattern of endurance rather than enlightenment. These exceptional individuals managed to transform suffering into meaning, finding in their physical deprivation a path to spiritual insight that justified the sacrifice. Their examples were held up by monastery leadership as proof that the system worked, but their rarity actually demonstrated how few people could survive the process with their humanity intact. The monasteries developed sophisticated methods for preventing escapes. Walls were high and gates were locked during certain hours, with guards posted to watch for unauthorized departures. Brothers were assigned to watch over new arrivals, creating a system of mutual surveillance that made planning escapes extremely difficult. The surrounding communities were instructed to return runaway monks for punishment, creating a network of cooperation that extended the monastery's control well beyond its physical boundaries. But most effective of all was the gradual erosion of hope. The slow realization that the world outside had moved on without you, that your family had likely forgotten you or been instructed to treat you as dead, that you had no skills or connections to survive in secular society after years of institutional dependence. Many monks who might have physically escaped remained because they could not imagine any life outside the monastery walls, their capacity for independent decision-making so thoroughly destroyed that freedom itself became terrifying. As your first week progresses, you feel this despair settling into your bones like the perpetual cold. Your body weakens on the inadequate diet and exhausting schedule, losing muscle mass and developing the gaunt appearance characteristic of long-term monks. Your mind grows fuzzy from constant hunger and sleep deprivation, making it difficult to concentrate on reading or remember simple instructions. Your spirit begins to crack under the relentless pressure to surrender everything that once defined you as an individual human being. The psychological transformation happens gradually, but inevitably. Your priorities shift from personal comfort and happiness to simple survival. You learn to find satisfaction in small things. A slightly warmer corner of the chapel, an extra piece of bread, a brief moment of rest between tasks. Your dreams change, becoming focused on basic needs rather than aspirations or hopes. You begin to think in terms of getting through each day, rather than planning for any future beyond the monastery walls. By the seventh day, you understand viscerally what the historical records only hint at. Medieval monasteries weren't just religious communities. They were machines designed to break human beings down and rebuild them according to very specific requirements. Some monks emerged from this process as genuinely holy men, capable of great spiritual insight and service to their communities. But many more emerged as hollow shells, their personalities scrubbed away, their capacity for independent thought carefully eroded through years of systematic psychological conditioning. The monastery bells continue their relentless marking of time, calling you to prayer, to work, to meals, to sleep. Each ring a reminder that your life is no longer your own, that every moment has been predetermined by rules written centuries before your birth. In surrendering your will to God, you've also surrendered it to a human institution with very earthly concerns about power, control, and the maintenance of order that serves the monastery's interests above individual welfare. This was the reality behind the peaceful image of monastic life. A reality that would have broken most modern people within days, and left even the strongest struggling to maintain their sanity and sense of self. The monastery walls contained not just prayer and contemplation, but a systematic process of psychological and physical transformation that few were truly prepared to endure. The suffering was not accidental but intentional, designed to achieve specific goals that served the institution's needs for obedient, broken individuals who would never challenge authority or question the system that sustained their oppression. As we move deeper into the shadows of medieval religious life, we'll discover that not all monastery inhabitants shared this harsh existence. But first, we must understand the foundation of suffering upon which the entire system was built. This foundation made possible the extraordinary contrasts we'll explore, where genuine spiritual achievement coexisted with systematic abuse, where great cultural preservation happened alongside deliberate human destruction, where the same walls that crushed individual spirits also sheltered some of history's most remarkable human achievements. Chapter 2: The Rise and Fall of Abbot Suger, Medieval Power Behind the Throne. The year is 191, And in a small village outside Paris, a peasant family makes a decision that will change the course of European history. They have too many mouths to feed, and their youngest son, a bright but sickly 10-year-old named Suger, shows promise that his humble circumstances cannot nurture. Like thousands of other poor families across medieval Europe, they choose to give their child to God, delivering him to the gates of the Abbey of Saint-Denis. Imagine this small boy, clutching perhaps a single possession, a wooden toy or a scrap of cloth from home, as massive doors close behind him forever. He doesn't yet know that he's just entered one of the most politically powerful monasteries in France, or that his peasant origins will paradoxically become the foundation for unprecedented influence over kings and kingdoms. But the irony is profound. In a world where birth determines destiny, only by surrendering everything can a peasant's son hope to achieve anything. The Abbey of Saint-Denis occupies a unique position in French political life, serving simultaneously as a religious community and the symbolic heart of royal authority. Founded in the 7th century on the burial site of Saint-Denis, the first bishop of Paris who was martyred by the Romans, the monastery has evolved into something far more than a simple religious house. French kings have chosen Saint-Denis as their burial place for over 400 years, creating a sacred geography that links royal legitimacy directly to this particular religious community. The royal regalia, the crown, scepter, and other symbols of French monarchy are kept within the abbey's walls, making the monks of Saint-Denis literal guardians of royal authority. When a new king is crowned, the ceremony begins at Saint-Denis with the ritual presentation of these sacred objects. The monastery's abbot traditionally serves as one of the 12 peers of France, holding a rank equivalent to the greatest dukes and counts in the kingdom. This convergence of religious and secular power creates opportunities that exist nowhere else in medieval society. Suger's early years at Saint-Denis follow the brutal pattern we explored earlier: the harsh discipline, the insufficient food, the back-breaking labor designed to crush individual will. But this particular child possesses something that sets him apart: an extraordinary intelligence, coupled with an almost supernatural ability to understand how power works, even from the bottom of the hierarchy. While other young oblates struggle simply to survive the physical demands of monastic life, Suger observes everything with the calculating mind of a born politician. He watches how the senior monks navigate the complex politics within the monastery walls, noting which alliances bring advancement and which positions carry real influence. He notices which brothers receive better food, lighter duties, more comfortable sleeping arrangements. He observes the constant stream of visitors to the abbey: noble pilgrims, royal messengers, wealthy donors who seek spiritual benefits through material contributions. Most importantly, he begins to understand that Saint-Denis isn't just a religious community. It's a nexus of power that touches every aspect of French political life. The Abbey scriptorium provides Suger with his first opportunity to demonstrate exceptional abilities. While copying manuscripts, he shows not just technical skill, but genuine understanding of the complex texts he reproduces, as Latin improves rapidly, progressing from basic literacy to sophisticated comprehension of theological, legal, and political documents. He begins to assist the abbey's correspondence, helping to draft letters to bishops, nobles, and royal officials, as his elegant handwriting and clear prose style catch the attention of senior administrators, who begin to rely on his skills. The monastery's extensive land holdings require constant administrative attention, and young Suger proves remarkably capable of managing these complex economic relationships. Medieval monasteries function as major economic institutions, controlling vast agricultural estates, operating mills and workshops, engaging in trade that spans international boundaries. Suger learns to navigate the intricate world of medieval finance, understanding systems of credit, currency exchange, and commercial law that would challenge modern business students. By his late teens, Suger has become indispensable to the abbey's daily operations. The older monks, many of them from noble families who initially looked down on the peasant boy, now seek his advice on everything from architectural repairs to managing the monastery's vast agricultural holdings. He's developed a network of contacts that extends far beyond the monastery walls. Merchants who supply the abbey, noble families who donate land and money, court officials who visit regularly to conduct royal business. But Suger's true genius reveals itself when he begins to cultivate relationships with members of the royal family itself. To Prince Louis, the future King Louis VII, becomes a frequent visitor to St. Denis, drawn by the abbey's political importance and its role in royal ceremonial life. Somehow, this young monk from peasant stock manages to capture the prince's attention and eventually his friendship. The exact nature of their early relationship remains shrouded in historical mystery, but the results speak for themselves. When Louis becomes king in 1108, Suger's rise to unprecedented power begins. The transformation is remarkable to witness through contemporary accounts. This man who once knelt on cold stone floors, subsisting on bread and thin gruel, gradually assumes responsibilities that would challenge the most sophisticated courtiers. King Louis VII trusts him with increasingly sensitive diplomatic missions, recognizing in Suger a combination of intelligence, discretion, and absolute loyalty that proves invaluable in the complex world of medieval politics. Suger negotiates with hostile nobles, mediates disputes between powerful bishops, and even helps plan military campaigns against rebellious vassals. Medieval diplomacy requires skills that combine legal knowledge, psychological insight, and cultural sophistication. Suger masters all of these disciplines, becoming one of the most effective negotiators of his generation. He understands that successful diplomacy often depends on understanding what each party truly wants beyond their stated positions, and he develops an almost uncanny ability to find solutions that satisfy competing interests without compromising royal authority. His reputation for fair dealing spreads throughout France and beyond, making him a trusted intermediary even among parties who distrust the king himself. The relationship between Suger and King Louis VII deepens into something resembling genuine friendship, despite the vast difference in their social origins. Contemporary chronicles describe them hunting together, sharing meals, engaging in theological discussions that reveal Suger's broad intellectual interests. The king values not just Suger's administrative skills, but his counsel on matters of policy and strategy. Here is a ruler who could command the advice of any noble in France, choosing instead to rely on the wisdom of a peasant's son, whose only qualification is demonstrated competence. In 1122, at the age of 41, Suger achieves what would have been unthinkable for a peasant's son in any other context. He's elected Abbot of St. Denis, making him one of the most powerful religious figures in France. The election process itself reveals the extent of his influence, as monks who might normally favor candidates from noble families choose instead to support this exceptional individual, whose abilities have become impossible to ignore. But this is only the beginning of his extraordinary ascent to power that will reshape both the monastery and the kingdom. The new abbot immediately sets about transforming not just his monastery, but the very nature of French royal authority. He understands that symbols matter as much as swords in medieval politics, and he begins an ambitious project to rebuild St. Denis as a monument to both divine and royal power. This isn't simple vanity. It's calculated political theatre designed to enhance the legitimacy and grandeur of the French crown, through architectural magnificence that will impress both domestic and foreign observers. Suger's architectural vision revolutionizes European building forever. Working with innovative master craftsmen, whose names history has largely forgotten, he develops what we now call Gothic architecture. Those soaring, pointed arches, vast windows filled with brilliant stained glass, and seemingly impossible heights that make the observer feel simultaneously humbled and uplifted. The new St. Denis becomes a jewel box of light and color, designed to convince anyone who enters that they stand in the presence of divine majesty made manifest through royal patronage. The technical innovations required for Gothic architecture represent genuine engineering breakthroughs that influence construction throughout Europe. The flying buttresses that support the unprecedented height of the walls, the ribbed vaulting that distributes weight more efficiently than previous systems, the mathematical precision required to calculate load bearing and stress distribution. All of these developments emerge from Suger's collaboration with master builders, who push the boundaries of what medieval technology can achieve. The result is architecture that seems to defy gravity itself, creating spaces that appear more heavenly than earthly. But the financial cost of this architectural marvel creates fascinating contradictions in Suger's character. Here is a monk who has taken vows of poverty, overseeing the expenditure of enormous sums on luxury beyond imagination. Golden altarpieces crafted by the finest goldsmiths in Europe, precious stones imported from distant lands, silk vestments embroidered with threads of actual gold, artistic treasures that would make kings envious fill the abbey. Suger justifies this apparent hypocrisy with sophisticated theological arguments about honoring God through beauty, but critics then and now have questioned whether he's serving divine glory or his own ambitions. Suger's own writings reveal the complexity of his thinking about wealth and spirituality. He argues that material beauty can serve spiritual purposes, lifting the mind from earthly concerns to contemplation of divine perfection. He cites biblical precedents for using precious materials in religious context, pointing to the detailed descriptions of Solomon's temple with its gold and jewels. He insists that the abbey's magnificence serves to honor Saint Denis and glorify the French monarchy that serves as God's earthly representative. Whether these arguments represent genuine belief or sophisticated rationalization remains a matter of scholarly debate. The king's trust in his peasant-born advisor continues to deepen throughout the 1120s and 1130s. When Louis XI departs on military campaigns against rebellious nobles, he increasingly leaves Suger in charge of royal administration. The monk is effectively ruling France in the king's absence, making decisions about taxation, justice, and foreign policy that affect millions of lives. The medieval world has seen nothing like this peasant's son wielding such secular authority while maintaining his religious vows and monastic identity. These periods of administrative responsibility reveal Suger's exceptional capabilities as a ruler. He demonstrates an understanding of royal finance that impresses even experienced courtiers, finding ways to increase revenue without provoking rebellion among taxpayers. He shows remarkable skill in managing the complex relationships between the crown and powerful nobles, using a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and carefully calibrated rewards and punishments to maintain order. His justice is considered fair by contemporary standards, and his administrative efficiency becomes legendary among those who work with the royal bureaucracy. When Louis V dies in 1137, Suger's influence faces its greatest test. The new king, Louis VII, is young, inexperienced, and surrounded by noble advisors who resent the power wielded by this upstart monk. Many expect Suger's political career to end with his patron's death, assuming that a new king will want his own advisors rather than those inherited from his predecessor. Instead, the opposite occurs. The young king proves even more dependent on Suger's wisdom and experience than his father had been. The transition reveals Suger's political sophistication at its highest level. Rather than attempting to maintain his influence through force or manipulation, he makes himself indispensable by demonstrating competence and loyalty that the new king cannot afford to lose. He carefully manages relationships with competing court factions, avoiding the appearance of favoritism while building coalitions that support royal authority. He shows perfect diplomatic tact in helping the young king establish his own identity while maintaining continuity with his father's successful policies. The ultimate validation of Suger's extraordinary rise comes in 1147, when King Louis VII decides to join the Second Crusade, leaving France for what everyone expects will be several years of holy war in the distant East. In an unprecedented move that shocks the nobility throughout Europe, Louis VII appoints Suger as regent of France, effectively making this former peasant boy the acting ruler of one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. The appointment represents the ultimate triumph of merit over birth, in a society that normally considers such advancement impossible. Imagine the magnitude of this transformation through the eyes of contemporaries who remember Suger's humble origins. The same man who once cleaned monastery latrines and copied manuscripts by candlelight now sits on the throne of France, making decisions that affect the fate of millions. He commands armies that include knights whose families have served royalty for generations, negotiates with foreign ambassadors who represent the most powerful rulers in Europe, and dispenses royal justice with an authority that derives entirely from demonstrated competence rather than inherited privilege. Chronicles of the time describe petitioners traveling from across Europe to seek audience with the monk regent, hoping to gain favor with this most unlikely of rulers. Italian merchants seek trade privileges, English envoys negotiate diplomatic agreements, German princes request military assistance, papal legates discuss church policy with a man whose religious authority derives from monastic vows, but whose secular power rivals that of any king. The convergence of spiritual and temporal authority in a single person represents something genuinely new in European political development. Suger's regency proves remarkably successful, by any measure that medieval people would recognize. He maintains peace within France's borders through a combination of skillful diplomacy and decisive action when negotiation fails. He skillfully manages the kingdom's finances, implementing policies that increase royal revenue while avoiding the excessive taxation that might provoke rebellion. He demonstrates administrative competence that surpasses many kings, showing that effective government depends more on intelligence and dedication than on noble birth or military prowess. His humble origins, rather than being a liability, seem to give him an understanding of common people's needs that eludes most noble rulers. He implements policies that benefit merchants and farmers, recognizing that royal prosperity depends ultimately on the economic health of the entire kingdom. He strengthens royal justice by ensuring that courts function efficiently and fairly, understanding that legitimate authority requires genuine service to those being governed. He maintains the delicate balance of power that keeps France's fractious nobility from open rebellion, while gradually strengthening royal authority at their expense. The regency also reveals Suger's remarkable ability to manage multiple complex relationships simultaneously. He must satisfy the needs of the church hierarchy while serving secular interests, balance the demands of powerful nobles against royal prerogatives, maintain diplomatic relationships with foreign powers while protecting French interests. He accomplishes all of this while serving as Abbot of Saint-Denis, continuing to oversee the monastery's reconstruction, and managing his own extensive correspondence with scholars, artists, and religious leaders throughout Europe. But power at this level comes with devastating personal costs that become increasingly apparent as the regency continues. The responsibilities of ruling France mean that Suger can rarely return to Saint-Denis, the monastery that has been his home for over 50 years. He's surrounded by courtiers and advisors, but he's fundamentally alone in ways that his monastic training never prepared him for. The weight of decisions that affect life and death, war and peace, prosperity and suffering, gradually takes its toll on his health and spirit in ways that observers note with growing concern. Contemporary accounts describe Suger aging rapidly during the regency, his hair turning white, his face becoming lined with the stress of constant decision-making. Decay develops the chronic ailments that plague medieval people who live under extreme pressure, digestive problems that reflect poor diet and irregular meals, joint pain that comes from long hours spent in conference and correspondence, eye strain from reading documents by candlelight, late into the night. The physical demands of ruling prove as challenging as any monastic discipline he previously endured. The psychological isolation proves even more difficult than the physical demands. Medieval kings surround themselves with families, wives, and children who provide emotional support and personal connection. Suger's monastic vows deny him these comforts, leaving him to bear the burdens of rulership without the human relationships that normally sustain those in power. He forms friendships with advisors and courtiers, but these relationships always carry the burden of political calculation that prevents genuine intimacy. The loneliness of absolute responsibility weighs heavily on a man whose monastic training emphasized community and shared purpose. When King Louis VII finally returns from the crusade in 1149, he finds a kingdom more prosperous and stable than the one he left behind. Suger's regency is universally acknowledged as a masterpiece of medieval governance, demonstrating that effective rule depends more on wisdom and dedication than on hereditary privilege or military reputation. Yet foreign observers note France's remarkable stability during the king's absence, commenting that the kingdom actually seems to have improved under the guidance of its unlikely regent. A successful regency establishes precedents for administrative government that influence French political development for centuries. But the monk who hands back the throne is visibly aged and transformed by his experience. Suger returns to Saint-Denis, but he's no longer the ambitious young monk who once dreamed of transforming his abbey. The final years of his life are marked by increasing frailty and a growing sense of spiritual reckoning with the contradictions of his extraordinary career. He completes his architectural masterpiece, writes detailed accounts of his experiences with the royal court, and prepares for a death that will mark the end of one of the most remarkable lives in medieval history. Suger's later writings reveal a complex individual struggling to reconcile his worldly achievements with his spiritual commitments. He defends his architectural extravagances with increasingly elaborate theological arguments, suggesting that criticism of his building projects troubled him more than he publicly acknowledged. He reflects on the nature of power and its relationship to Christian virtue, grappling with questions that have no easy answers in medieval thought. He seems to understand that his life represents something unprecedented in European history, but he's uncertain whether his achievements represent divine blessing or dangerous innovation. The physical toll of his extraordinary career becomes increasingly evident as Suger enters his final years. The man who once possessed seemingly boundless energy now struggles with the routine demands of monastic life. His handwriting, once elegantly precise, becomes shaky and difficult to read. His memory, previously renowned for its accuracy, begins to show gaps and inconsistencies. He relies increasingly on younger monks to handle administrative details that he once managed effortlessly, a transition that must have been particularly difficult for someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. When Abbot Suger dies in 1151 at the age of 70, his funeral draws mourners from across Europe in a display of respect that reflects his unique position in medieval society. Kings and peasants, bishops and merchants, nobles and common folk all recognize that they're witnessing the end of an era. This peasant's son had fundamentally changed the relationship between church and state, between religious authority and secular power, in ways that would influence European politics for centuries to come. His death marks the passing not just of an individual, but of a particular moment when exceptional personal qualities could transcend the normal barriers of medieval social structure. But perhaps most remarkably, Suger's story reveals the strange opportunities that medieval monasteries could provide for exceptional individuals. The same institutions that broke the spirits of so many others occasionally became launching pads for careers that would have been impossible in any other context. A peasant boy could never have become a courtier or a noble through normal social channels, but a peasant monk with extraordinary abilities might just change the world through the unique convergence of circumstances that medieval religious life sometimes provided. The irony is profound and speaks to the complex contradictions embedded in medieval society. The monastery walls that imprisoned most inmates sometimes became the very foundation for unprecedented freedom and influence. Suger's success story stands as a fascinating counterpoint to the suffering we explored earlier, revealing that the same system capable of crushing human spirits could also, under very specific circumstances, elevate individuals to heights of achievement that would be remarkable in any historical period. His life demonstrates both the oppressive nature of evil hierarchies and their occasional capacity for genuine transformation through exceptional merit and favorable circumstances. As we'll discover next, not all monastery treasures were as visible as Suger's architectural achievements or as dramatic as his political career. Some of the most precious things these institutions preserved were hidden away, protected from a world that might not have understood their value, until that protection itself became a different kind of loss that haunts our understanding of the medieval world and its intellectual achievements. Chapter 3: The Lost Library of Monte Cassino. Books that vanished from history. High in the mountains of central Italy, approximately 80 miles southeast of Rome, stands a monastery that has witnessed nearly 15 centuries of human history. Monte Cassino, founded by Saint Benedict himself around 50, became something far more significant than just another religious community. It evolved into Europe's greatest repository of ancient knowledge, a library so vast and precious that its partial destruction during World War II is still mourned by scholars today. The very stones of this place have absorbed the whispers of countless scribes, the rustle of parchment, and the silent tears of those who understood they were witnessing the slow death of an entire civilization. But the tragedy of Monte Cassino isn't just about what was lost in 1944. It's about the countless treasures that disappeared over the centuries, manuscripts that contain knowledge we can barely imagine, texts that might have changed our understanding of the ancient world forever. Tonight, we explore not just what we know was lost, but what we suspect may have been hidden away, waiting in forgotten chambers, or destroyed by ignorance, politics, and the simple passage of time that consumes human achievement with indifferent regularity. Imagine walking through the monastery's corridors in the year 800, when Charlemagne's scribes were working feverishly to preserve what remained of classical learning. The library at Monte Cassino already contained treasures beyond measure. Original works by Roman historians whose names we know only from fragments, complete texts of Greek philosophers that exist today, only in partial copies, and perhaps most tantalizingly, books that no modern scholar has ever seen, manuscripts whose very existence can only be inferred from oblique references in other texts that survived the centuries of loss and destruction. The early monks of Monte Cassino understood something that many of their contemporaries did not. They were living through the collapse of an entire civilization. The Western Roman Empire had fallen, Barbarian invasions had scattered populations across Europe, and the sophisticated urban culture that had preserved classical learning for centuries was crumbling into rural feudalism. These monks saw themselves not just as spiritual guardians, but as the last line of defense against a dark age that might swallow human knowledge forever, leaving future generations to grope in intellectual darkness. The scale of their preservation efforts was extraordinary by any measure. Teams of scribes worked in shifts around the clock, copying manuscripts by candlelight and lamp flame, their hands cramping as they transferred thousands of pages from fragile originals to fresh parchment. They developed sophisticated techniques for restoring damaged texts, carefully scraping away corrupted portions and reconstructing missing passages from context and parallel sources. The monastery became a kind of intellectual hospital, where dying texts received emergency treatment that might preserve them for future generations. The scriptorium at Monte Cassino represented the cutting edge of medieval technology and organization. Master scribes supervised teams of copyists, each specializing in particular types of text or specific scripts. Illuminators added decorative elements that made manuscripts both beautiful and valuable, their intricate designs serving practical purposes by helping readers navigate complex texts. The bookbinders created covers that could protect precious contents for centuries, using techniques that combined artistic skill with practical engineering. The entire operation required coordination that rivals modern publishing houses in its complexity and ambition. But they also made choices that haunt us today, decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but now appear tragically short-sighted. Parchment was expensive and time-consuming to produce, requiring the skins of dozens of animals for a single large manuscript, so the monks often reused older texts, scraping away less important works to make room for Christian writings. These palimpists, as scholars call them, contained layers of history. Sometimes a gospel would be written over the top of a classical poem, or a theological treatise would obscure a work of ancient science that might have advanced human knowledge by centuries. The decision-making process for what to preserve and what to sacrifice reveals the complex intellectual world of early medieval monasticism. Monks had to balance their spiritual mission against practical limitations, choosing between saving pagan poetry and Christian theology, between preserving historical chronicles and copying biblical commentaries, between maintaining scientific texts and reproducing liturgical works. Each choice represented a judgment about what future generations would need most, decisions made by individuals who could never have imagined the world we inhabit today. Modern technology has begun to reveal some of these hidden texts, using advanced imaging techniques that can penetrate layers of overwritten parchment. Researchers can now read the underlying writing on many palimpsests, discovering works that were thought lost forever. In some cases, they found the only surviving copies of ancient texts, preserved accidentally beneath medieval religious writings like archaeological artifacts buried in literary soil. But for every palimpsest that can be recovered, dozens more were probably created and subsequently lost to fire, flood, war, or simple neglect that claimed so much of medieval culture. The library's reputation grew throughout the medieval period, attracting scholars from across Europe and beyond in an intellectual pilgrimage that transcended religious and cultural boundaries. Muslim intellectuals from Spain and Sicily came to consult texts unavailable anywhere else, bringing with them Arabic translations of Greek works that had been lost in the Latin West. Jewish scholars arrived seeking Hebrew manuscripts that had been preserved when their communities were scattered by persecution and violence. Byzantine Greeks traveled from Constantinople to access classical works that had been lost in the East during centuries of war and political upheaval. This scholarly exchange created one of the most fascinating aspects of Monte Cassino's hidden history: the probability that the library contained works from all three of the Mediterranean's great intellectual traditions. Christian, Muslim, and Jewish texts likely sat side by side on the shelves, their preservation prioritized over religious differences. When it came to saving human knowledge from oblivion, the monastery became a kind of neutral ground where intellectual curiosity could overcome sectarian boundaries, at least temporarily, and in the service of preserving texts that might otherwise disappear forever. Among the most tantalizing losses are the complete works of classical historians, whose partial survival torments modern scholars. We know that Monte Cassino once possessed full copies of Livy's massive history of Rome, all 42 books of it, compared to the mere 35 books that survive today in fragments scattered across various libraries. Imagine what we might learn about the Roman Republic and early empire if we could read those missing volumes. The political intrigue, the military campaigns, the social changes that shaped the ancient world, all recorded by one of history's greatest historians, and then lost to time through accidents and deliberate choices that seemed reasonable to those who made them. The monastery also preserved scientific works that might have accelerated human progress by centuries if they had remained available to later scholars. Ancient treatises on engineering, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics disappeared from Monte Cassino's shelves, taking with them knowledge that had to be painfully rediscovered during the Renaissance and beyond. Some scholars believe that certain mechanical innovations attributed to the Renaissance were actually rediscoveries of classical techniques that had been preserved in monastic libraries and then lost through the disasters that repeatedly struck medieval institutions. Medieval medicine, in particular, might have developed along entirely different lines if certain Greek and Roman medical texts had survived. We know from fragmentary references that Monte Cassino once possessed complete works by ancient physicians whose understanding of anatomy, surgery, and disease treatment was remarkably sophisticated. These texts disappeared during the various disasters that struck the monastery, forcing later medical scholars to reconstruct basic knowledge from incomplete sources and often inaccurate translations. The human cost of these losses can be measured in centuries of medical ignorance that caused unnecessary suffering. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Monte Cassino's collection involves the works that the church itself may have chosen to suppress. Medieval monasteries sometimes served as repositories for texts that church authorities considered dangerous or heretical, preserved not for study but for safekeeping, a kind of theological quarantine that kept potentially corrupting ideas away from general circulation while maintaining them for future reference. These collections created fascinating contradictions within monastic libraries, where orthodox religious works shared shelf space with texts that challenged fundamental church doctrines. These suppressed texts might have included early Christian writings that presented different versions of gospel stories, philosophical works that challenged church doctrine about the nature of God and creation, or scientific treatises that contradicted official theological positions about the structure of the universe. The existence of such texts is hinted at in medieval catalogues and correspondence, but the books themselves have vanished, leaving us to wonder what alternative histories and suppressed knowledge they might have contained. What different understanding of Christianity might have emerged if these texts had remained available to scholars throughout the medieval period? The mystery deepens when we consider the physical layout of medieval monasteries and the opportunities it created for concealment. Monte Cassino, like many large abbeys, was rebuilt and expanded numerous times over the centuries. Each reconstruction created opportunities for books to be moved, hidden, or simply lost in the confusion of architectural transformation. Archaeological excavations have occasionally revealed chambers that were sealed and forgotten, sometimes containing objects that had been missing for centuries, waiting in darkness for rediscovery by later generations who had given up hope of finding them. In the 1950s, during the reconstruction following World War II, workers discovered a walled-up room that contained several manuscripts that had been presumed lost for over 400 years. If one such chamber could survive undetected for centuries, how many others might still exist, their contents waiting in darkness for rediscovery by archaeologists or construction workers? Modern ground-penetrating radar and other archaeological techniques have identified anomalies in the monastery structure that might represent additional hidden spaces, but the site's continuing religious function limits extensive excavation that might reveal these secrets. The political upheavals that periodically swept through Italy created additional opportunities for manuscripts to disappear into private collections or foreign libraries. When Napoleon's armies occupied the monastery in 1799, they reportedly removed cartloads of books and documents to French libraries as part of their systematic looting of Italian cultural treasures. Some of these texts have been tracked down in Paris and other French cities, but many others seem to have vanished during transport or been dispersed into private collections where they remain unrecognized by scholars who might identify their true significance. Earlier invasions were even more destructive to the monastery's intellectual treasures. When Saracen raiders sacked Monte Cassino in 83, the monks had time to hide some of their most precious manuscripts before fleeing to temporary refuge in other monasteries. Some of these emergency hiding places were recovered when the monks returned years later, but others were forgotten in the chaos of evacuation and resettlement that followed the attack. The locations of these hidden caches died with the monks who concealed them, leaving tantalizing possibilities for future discovery by archaeologists or historians who might decode clues left in surviving documents. The monastery's own records hint at the scope of what was lost through these various disasters and deliberate concealments. Medieval catalogues describe works by authors whose names appear nowhere else in surviving literature, suggesting that Monte Cassino preserved texts by writers whose entire literary output disappeared along with their only surviving copies. Some of these may have been alternative titles for known works, but others probably represent completely lost authors whose insights into ancient life, thought, and culture died with the destruction of their manuscripts. We can only imagine what perspectives on the classical world were silenced forever by these losses. Modern scholars have attempted to reconstruct the probable contents of Monte Cassino's library through careful analysis of medieval references, citations, and catalogues that survive in other libraries. Their work reveals a collection that would have rivaled the Great Library of Alexandria in scope and importance, containing works of literature, history, philosophy, science, and theology from across the ancient world. Many of these texts existed in unique copies that could be found nowhere else, making their loss an irreparable blow to human knowledge that still affects scholarly understanding of the classical period. The monastery's role as a center of translation work added another dimension to its intellectual importance, and to the tragedy of its losses. Monte Cassino served as one of the primary points where Greek texts were translated into Latin, making classical learning accessible to Western European scholars who could not read the original languages. Many of these translations have been lost, taking with them not just the content of ancient works, but also the medieval scholarly apparatus that surrounded them. The commentaries, annotations, and interpretive frameworks that helped medieval readers understand classical texts. The manuscript illumination work done at Monte Cassino represented another form of cultural achievement that was largely destroyed over the centuries. The monastery's artists created some of the finest illuminated manuscripts of the medieval period, combining classical artistic traditions with Christian themes in ways that influenced European art for generations. And most of these artistic treasures have been lost, either destroyed in various disasters or scattered to museums and private collections where they exist in isolation from the intellectual context that gave them meaning. The scientific manuscripts preserved at Monte Cassino included works on astronomy that might have prevented some of the astronomical errors that plagued medieval European understanding of the cosmos. Ancient Greek and Roman astronomers had achieved remarkable accuracy in their observations and calculations, but much of this knowledge was lost when the manuscripts that contained it disappeared from monastic libraries. The result was centuries of astronomical ignorance that affected everything from calendar calculations to navigation techniques that might have enabled earlier exploration and discovery. Mathematical texts represent another category of loss that had profound practical consequences for medieval European development. Ancient mathematicians had developed sophisticated techniques for engineering, architecture, and commerce that were lost when their writings disappeared from monastic libraries. The rediscovery of these techniques during the Renaissance required centuries of painstaking reconstruction, delaying technological and economic development that might have occurred much earlier if the original texts had been preserved. The final tragedy came on February 15, 1944. When Allied bombing reduced the monastery to rubble in one of the most devastating cultural disasters of World War II. Despite efforts to evacuate the most precious manuscripts, much of the library was destroyed in the bombardment and subsequent fires that consumed centuries of accumulated knowledge in a matter of hours. Irreplaceable illuminated manuscripts that had survived barbarian invasions, medieval warfare, and natural disasters for over 1,000 years were reduced to ash in an attack that served no strategic military purpose. The irony is profound and speaks to the random nature of historical destruction. The monastery was bombed because military commanders believed it was being used as a German observation post, but in fact the German forces had evacuated the building and were positioned outside the monastery grounds. The cultural treasure that died that day served no military purpose for either side in the conflict, making its destruction a pure loss that benefited no one and impoverished all of humanity. The bombing represents one of the most clear-cut cases of cultural vandalism in modern warfare. Yet, even this well-documented tragedy contains mysteries that continue to puzzle historians and librarians. Some manuscripts that were reportedly destroyed in 1944 have since surfaced in private collections or foreign libraries, suggesting that additional evacuation efforts may have occurred beyond what was officially recorded. Other texts that were supposedly saved appear to be missing from post-war inventories, raising questions about what might have been looted during the chaos of reconstruction or sold on black markets that traffic in stolen cultural artifacts. The immediate aftermath of the bombing created opportunities for further losses, as people scrambled through the rubble, looking for valuables or souvenirs. Allied soldiers, German troops, and local civilians all had access to the destroyed monastery in the days and weeks following the attack. Some undoubtedly collected manuscripts or fragments as war trophies. Not understanding their scholarly value, these artifacts may still exist in private hands, unknown to their owners, and unavailable to researchers who might recognize their significance if given the opportunity to examine them. Today, Monte Cassino has been rebuilt, and its library partly restored, but it can never again be what it once was. A unique window into the ancient world. A repository of human knowledge that spanned cultures and centuries. The monks continue their work of preservation and scholarship, but they're preserving the fragments that remain rather than the comprehensive collection that once made their monastery one of the intellectual centers of Europe. The rebuilt library is impressive by modern standards, but represents only a shadow of what was lost in the centuries of disasters that struck this remarkable institution. The loss extends beyond mere historical curiosity and affects our understanding of fundamental questions about human development. Some of the vanished texts might have contained practical knowledge that could benefit humanity today. Medical techniques that were more advanced than we realize. Agricultural methods that could improve food production. Engineering solutions that might address modern infrastructure challenges. Or philosophical insights that took centuries to redevelop through independent thought. We live in a world slightly diminished by their absence, forever wondering what wisdom went up in smoke or crumbled into dust in forgotten chambers. Modern attempts to recover lost knowledge from Monte Cassino continue through various archaeological and technological approaches. Digital imaging techniques allow scholars to read faded or damaged manuscripts that were previously illegible, revealing texts that seemed permanently lost. Archaeological excavations occasionally uncover fragments or artifacts that provide clues about the monastery's former collections. International cooperation between libraries and museums sometimes reunite scattered fragments of manuscripts that were dispersed over the centuries. The story of Monte Cassino's lost library serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of human knowledge and the importance of preservation efforts in our own time. The books and ideas we take for granted today might be tomorrow's mysterious losses, puzzles for future scholars to ponder as they wonder what we knew and how we lost it. The monks of Monte Cassino understood this fragility better than most, dedicating their lives to preservation against the constant threat of oblivion. A battle they fought with remarkable success for over 1,000 years, even though they ultimately could not win it completely against the forces of time, war, and human short-sightedness. As we contemplate these vanished treasures, we're reminded that the empty spaces on reconstructed shelves speak to more than missing books. They represent the gaps in our understanding of who we are and where we came from, mysteries that may never be solved because the evidence disappeared into the darkness of time, leaving us to wonder what other voices from the past might have spoken to us. If only their words had survived the accidents and deliberate choices that shape what each generation inherits from those who came before. Chapter 4. Inside the Abbot's Palace. How medieval church elite lived like kings. Step now from the cold stone cells where common monks shivered through winter nights, and enter a different world entirely, one that existed within the same monastery walls but might as well have been on another planet. In the abbot's quarters of wealthy medieval monasteries, a parallel universe of luxury, power, and sophisticated comfort flourished while brothers starved and suffered mere corridors away. The contrast is so stark it seems almost impossible to believe, yet the historical evidence is overwhelming and documented in accounts that survive from visitors who witnessed both worlds within the same institution. While ordinary monks slept on straw mattresses and ate thin gruel, their abbots reclined on silk cushions in heated chambers, dining on delicacies imported from across the known world. This wasn't occasional indulgence or special feast day celebration. It was an entire lifestyle built on the very donations that were supposed to support the monastery's spiritual mission. The systematic nature of this inequality reveals the extent to which medieval monasticism had evolved into something far removed from its original ideals of poverty and communal suffering. Imagine walking through the gates of Cluny Abbey in its 12th century heyday, when it controlled over 1,000 monasteries across Europe, and commanded wealth, that rivaled royal treasuries. The common monks' quarters are exactly what we explored earlier. Harsh, cold, Spartan to the point of cruelty. But if you follow a different corridor, past guards who check your credentials and ensure your worthiness for admission, you enter the Abbot's residential complex, through doors that seem to open onto an entirely different civilization. The transformation is breathtaking and would have shocked contemporary observers who expected religious institutions to maintain consistent standards of austerity. Thick tapestries from Constantinople hang on plastered walls that are actually painted with scenes from classical mythology, their vibrant colors and intricate designs representing artistic achievement that rivals the greatest secular palaces. The floors are covered, not with rushes and straw, but with carpets from the Islamic world, their intricate patterns speaking of trade routes and cultural exchanges that span continents and require enormous financial resources to maintain. Braziers burn aromatic wood that fills the air with expensive perfumes imported from distant lands, while glass windows, still a luxury beyond imagination for most medieval people, filter colored light into chambers that feel more like a palace than a place of prayer. The very air in these rooms carries the scent of prosperity, of spices and incense that cost more than most peasant families earn in a year. These sensory details create an atmosphere of comfort and sophistication that stands in deliberate contrast to the harsh austerity imposed on common monks just steps away. The abbot's private chapel alone costs more to maintain than most monasteries' entire annual budgets, representing a concentration of wealth that would be remarkable in any context. Golden altarpieces catch the light from hundreds of beeswax candles, their flames reflecting off precious stones embedded in religious artifacts that combine spiritual symbolism with ostentatious display of material wealth. The vestments hanging in sacristy wardrobes are works of art in themselves. Silk chasubles embroidered with threads of actual gold, copes lined with ermine and decorated with pearls that represent the labor of skilled craftsmen across Europe. Liturgical objects crafted by the finest artisans, whose services are reserved for the highest levels of society. But perhaps the most shocking contrast lies in the kitchens that serve these two different worlds within the same institution. While common monks receive their daily portion of coarse bread and watery ale, measured out with mathematical precision to ensure no one receives more than the absolute minimum, the abbot's kitchen staff prepare feasts that would make kings envious and foreign ambassadors impressed with the monastery's importance. Multiple courses featuring exotic spices that cost fortunes to import, rare wines from distant vineyards whose bottles represent months of ordinary monks' labor, fresh meat prepared by skilled cooks who understand techniques far beyond the simple boiling and roasting available to ordinary people. A typical dinner in the abbot's hall might include venison from the monastery's private hunting grounds, prepared with imported spices that cost more than a peasant family's annual income. The very idea that a monastery maintains hunting grounds for the pleasure of its leadership reveals how far these institutions had departed from their original spiritual mission. There's fish from monastery ponds, seasoned with herbs grown in private gardens tended by specialists whose only job is maintaining the abbot's personal food supply. Fruits preserved in honey and wine using techniques that require considerable expertise. Candied nuts from Mediterranean groves. Cheeses aged in controlled conditions that represent the cutting edge of medieval food technology. The guest quarters reserved for visiting nobility and wealthy donors showcase even more elaborate luxuries that demonstrate the monastery's political importance. Rooms heated by sophisticated hypercourse systems adapted from Roman engineering, creating comfortable temperatures that common monks never experience even in the depths of winter. Private bath facilities with hot water supplied by complex plumbing networks that require constant maintenance by skilled craftsmen, and furniture crafted by master woodworkers whose skills were reserved exclusively for the highest levels of society. The very existence of such accommodations within monastic walls reveals the extent to which these institutions served secular as well as spiritual purposes. These accommodations weren't just about comfort. They were political statements designed to demonstrate the monastery's power and influence to visitors who might support or threaten its interests. When kings and nobles visited, they needed to see that the church could match or exceed their own standards of luxury and sophistication. Failure to provide appropriate magnificence might be interpreted as weakness, potentially costing the monastery valuable donations, legal protections, or political alliances that were essential for its survival in the competitive world of medieval politics. The abbot's quarters served as a stage for diplomatic theatre that affected the fate of thousands of people. The abbots themselves lived as princes of the church in the most literal sense, their daily schedules bearing little resemblance to the harsh routine we explored earlier. While common monks rose at 2:30 a.m. for prayers in freezing chapels, abbots often retired to private chapels, where they could fulfill their religious obligations in comfort, surrounded by beautiful art and attended by personal chaplains, who handled the most demanding aspects of liturgical duty. This delegation of spiritual responsibility created a system where the highest religious authorities had the least direct contact with the hardships that supposedly built character and brought believers closer to God. Administrative responsibilities consumed much of an abbot's time, but these weren't the simple record-keeping tasks that modern people might imagine when thinking about monastery management. Major monasteries were economic powerhouses that controlled vast agricultural estates covering thousands of acres, operated mills and workshops that produced goods for international markets, maintained their own courts of justice with the power to impose sentences including death, and engaged in complex financial transactions that spanned international boundaries and required sophisticated understanding of law, currency, and commerce. Abbots needed to master skills in law, finance, diplomacy, and military strategy that would challenge the most sophisticated secular rulers. The Abbot of St. Denis, whom we met earlier through Suger's remarkable story, controlled lands that generated revenues comparable to those of major duchies, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in France. And he maintained a private army capable of fielding hundreds of armed men, negotiated treaties with foreign powers as an equal partner rather than a subordinate, and lived in accommodations that rivaled the royal palaces of smaller kingdoms. His daily life involved audiences with ambassadors from across Europe, strategy sessions with military commanders who planned campaigns affecting thousands of lives, and business meetings with merchants whose trade network stretched from England to the Byzantine Empire. This lifestyle required a supporting cast that would have amazed contemporary observers, and reveals the extent of resources diverted from the monastery's supposed spiritual mission. Personal servants attended to every aspect of daily comfort, valets who maintained extensive wardrobes that would have clothed entire families of common monks, or cooks who specialized in particular types of cuisine, and had access to ingredients that ordinary people never saw. Scribes who handled correspondence in multiple languages, and possessed educational backgrounds that surpassed most secular courtiers. Guards who provided security worthy of a royal court and were armed with the finest weapons available. The abbot's household staff often numbered in the dozens, creating a miniature court within the larger monastery community that consumed resources and attention that were supposed to be directed towards spiritual purposes. The intellectual life available to these church elite represented another stark contrast with the limited education accessible to common monks who spent their days in manual labor. While ordinary brothers might spend their lives copying texts they couldn't fully understand, working with Latin phrases whose meaning escaped them completely. Abbots maintained private libraries filled with works on philosophy, science, literature, and politics that represented the cutting edge of medieval intellectual achievement. They corresponded with scholars across Europe, commissioned original works from leading intellectuals whose services were available only to the highest bidders, and participated in theological and philosophical debates that shaped the development of medieval thought and influenced political decisions affecting millions of people. Many abbots were accomplished artists and writers in their own right, using their positions and resources to pursue creative interests that would have been impossible for ordinary monks. They composed poetry that was circulated among intellectual elites, designed architectural innovations that influenced building across Europe, and created illuminated manuscripts that represent some of the finest artistic achievements of the medieval period. Their patronage supported entire schools of artists, musicians, and scholars whose work might never have existed without church funding and protection, creating a cultural flowering that depended on the systematic exploitation of common monks whose labor made such luxury possible. The political power wielded by major abbots often exceeded that of secular nobles, making them key players in the complex game of medieval politics. They controlled the appointment of bishops in territories under their influence, mediated disputes between kings whose conflicts could devastate entire regions, and sometimes commanded military forces in their own right that could tip the balance in important wars. The Abbot of Fulda in Germany ruled territory larger than many independent principalities, maintained diplomatic relations with the Holy Roman Emperor as an equal, and lived in a palace complex that dwarfed the residences of most dukes and counts. His court included scholars, artists, and administrators whose sophistication rivaled anything available in secular courts. But this concentration of wealth and power within monastic institutions created profound contradictions that troubled even medieval observers who generally accepted social inequality as natural. The church reformers regularly denounced the luxury of monastic life, pointing out the obvious hypocrisy of monks who had taken vows of poverty while living in splendor that exceeded the dreams of most lay people. These criticisms weren't just theological abstractions, they represented genuine anger from populations who donated to monasteries expecting their gifts to support spiritual activities, not aristocratic lifestyles that seemed to mock the very principles these institutions claimed to represent. The most sophisticated abbots developed elaborate justifications for their luxury that reveal both their intellectual sophistication and their moral flexibility. They argued that magnificent church buildings and beautiful liturgical objects honored God in ways that simple poverty could not, citing biblical precedents for using precious materials in religious contexts. They claimed that impressive accommodations were necessary for effective diplomacy and administration, pointing out that secular authorities would not respect religious leaders who appeared weak or impoverished. They insisted that church wealth, properly managed, could accomplish more good for society than individual poverty and suffering that would limit the institution's ability to serve broader social needs. Some of these arguments had merit and reflected genuine complexity in the relationship between wealth and social good. Medieval monasteries did operate hospitals that served broader communities, schools that provided education to people who would otherwise remain illiterate, to charitable institutions that fed thousands of poor people during times of famine and economic hardship. They preserved classical learning through expensive copying and translation projects, supported artistic innovation that enriched European culture, and maintained agricultural techniques that fed entire regions. The wealth concentrated in church institutions sometimes translated into genuine social benefits that wouldn't have existed under more egalitarian arrangements that lacked the resources for major projects. But the human cost of this system was enormous, and cannot be justified by its occasional benefits to broader society. The suffering we explored in our first segment wasn't an unfortunate side effect of monastic life. It was a deliberate feature designed to concentrate resources and labor for the benefit of a small ecclesiastical elite. The harsh discipline, inadequate food, and brutal working conditions experienced by common monks subsidized the luxury enjoyed by their superiors in a system that was consciously designed to create and maintain inequality within institutions supposedly dedicated to spiritual equality. The irony becomes even more bitter when we consider that many of these wealthy abbots came from noble families that could have provided them with comfortable secular careers if they had chosen different paths. They chose monastic life not as a sacrifice or spiritual discipline, but as a path to power and influence that might exceed what was available through traditional aristocratic channels. Meanwhile, the peasant-born monks who genuinely needed the monastery's support received the harshest treatment and the fewest opportunities for advancement, creating a system where religious institutions reproduced and intensified the social inequalities they claimed to transcend through spiritual brotherhood. This system persisted for centuries because it served multiple powerful interests that benefited from its continuation. The noble families could place younger sons in prestigious church positions without dividing inherited estates among too many heirs, ensuring that family wealth remained concentrated while providing comfortable careers for surplus offspring. The royal governments could rely on educated, wealthy ecclesiastical administrators who couldn't pass their positions on to biological heirs, reducing the risk of creating rival dynasties that might challenge royal authority. The church itself accumulated vast resources that supported its political and cultural influence across European society, making it a major player in international politics and cultural development. The economic systems that supported abbatial luxury were sophisticated and far-reaching, involving trade networks that spanned continents and financial arrangements that would impress modern economists. The monasteries operated as early banks, lending money to nobles and merchants while charging interest rates that generated enormous profits. They controlled agricultural production on a massive scale, using efficient management techniques to maximize yields that could be sold in urban markets. They manufactured goods ranging from illuminated manuscripts to fine textiles, employing skilled craftsmen whose products commanded premium prices among wealthy customers. The profits from all these activities flowed upward to support the lifestyles of ecclesiastical elites, while common monks continued to live in poverty. The architectural evidence for abbatial luxury remains visible today in the ruins and reconstructed buildings that survive from the medieval period. Palace complexes within monastery grounds feature sophisticated heating systems, private gardens designed for pleasure rather than utility, and decorative elements that rival anything found in secular courts. Archaeological excavations regularly uncover artifacts that reveal the extent of luxury enjoyed by church elites. Imported pottery, jewelry, and personal items that demonstrate access to international trade networks and enormous disposable income. These material remains provide concrete evidence for the lifestyle disparities that written sources sometimes downplay or justify through theological arguments. The contrast in dining arrangements reveals the systematic nature of inequality within monastic communities. While common monks ate from wooden bowls in unheated halls, abbots and their guests dined from silver and gold vessels in warm chambers, decorated with tapestries and art. The very dishes used for serving food were worth more than most people earned in their entire lives, representing a concentration of wealth that would be remarkable in any historical period. Surviving inventories from major monasteries list table settings that include hundreds of pieces of precious metalwork, each item representing weeks or months of skilled labor that could have improved conditions for ordinary monks. The scandal of monastic luxury eventually contributed to the massive religious upheavals of the later medieval period that transformed European Christianity. When the Protestant Reformation began in the 16th century, monastic wealth and clerical luxury provided some of the most effective propaganda tools for reformers who sought to discredit the established church. The obvious hypocrisy of monks living like princes while preaching poverty helped convince entire populations that fundamental religious change was necessary. Reformers could point to concrete examples of corruption that ordinary people could see and understand without requiring sophisticated theological arguments. Martin Luther and other Protestant leaders made extensive use of these contradictions in their attacks on Catholic monasticism, describing in vivid detail the luxury enjoyed by abbots, while their subordinates suffered in conditions that resembled slavery more than spiritual discipline. These criticisms resonated with populations who had observed the disparities firsthand, either through direct experience or through stories passed down from family members who had worked in or near monastic institutions. The Reformation's success depended partly on its ability to articulate popular anger about religious hypocrisy that had been building for centuries. Modern visitors to surviving medieval monasteries can still see evidence of this dual world that existed within the same institutional structures. The reconstructed cells and refectories where common monks lived tell one story of austerity and deprivation, while the abbot's quarters and guest chambers reveal an entirely different reality of comfort and sophistication. The museums display both the coarse wooden bowls used by ordinary brothers and the golden chalices reserved for ecclesiastical elite, artifacts that seem to come from different civilizations despite sharing the same buildings and the same historical moment. These material contrasts provide concrete evidence for lifestyle disparities that might otherwise seem too extreme to believe. The psychological impact of these disparities on ordinary monks can only be imagined, but must have been devastating for individuals who had surrendered everything in expectation of joining a community of spiritual equals. To work in kitchens preparing elaborate feasts they would never taste, to clean luxury quarters they would never occupy, to maintain gardens whose beauty they could observe but never enjoy, must have created profound resentment and disillusionment among those whose labor made such luxury possible. The vows of obedience that prevented them from expressing these feelings openly probably intensified their psychological suffering. Some monasteries developed elaborate rituals designed to make inequality seem natural and spiritually justified, ceremonies that emphasized the different roles played by different members of the community. Common monks were taught that their suffering served a higher purpose, that their sacrifice enabled others to perform more important spiritual and administrative work. These ideological justifications probably convinced some individuals, but the need for such extensive rationalization suggests that the inequality troubled many people who lived within these systems. The international connections maintained by wealthy abbots created networks of privilege that spanned Europe and beyond, linking religious elites across political and cultural boundaries. Or, abbots exchanged gifts that would have supported entire communities of common monks, visited each other's monasteries in processions that resembled royal progresses, and collaborated on projects that required enormous resources and sophisticated coordination. These networks reinforced the separation between ecclesiastical elites and ordinary monks, creating a parallel world of privilege that existed alongside but separate from the harsh realities of common monastic life. As we drift towards sleep, consider the profound human capacity for creating separate realities within shared spaces, and the psychological mechanisms that allow people to rationalize obvious injustices. The same stone walls that enclosed brutal poverty also sheltered unprecedented luxury, demonstrating how architectural space can be divided to create entirely different lived experiences. The same religious vows that condemned some men to lifelong suffering elevated others to heights of power and comfort that secular society could rarely match, revealing the flexibility of spiritual ideals when they encounter practical politics. The same donations given by faithful believers to support God's work on earth funded both genuine spiritual activities and aristocratic lifestyles that would have shocked the original donors, showing how institutional purposes can evolve in ways that contradict their founding principles. Perhaps most remarkably, this system worked for centuries because all participants, from the suffering monks to the luxurious abbots to the donating faithful, found ways to believe that their particular role served a higher purpose that justified obvious inequalities. The contradictions that seem obvious to modern observers were embedded so deeply in medieval assumptions about hierarchy, authority, and spiritual value that they remained largely invisible to the people who lived within them. This psychological adaptation reveals something profound about human nature and our capacity to rationalize systems that serve our interests while harming others. The monastery bells that called common monks to prayer at 2:30 a.m. also marked time for abbots who might be concluding elegant dinner parties or private audiences with visiting dignitaries. The same sound carried different meanings for different ears, just as the same religious commitment created vastly different lived experiences for different members of the monastic community. These parallel worlds existed side by side for centuries, sustained by ideologies that made inequality seem natural and necessary rather than the result of human choices that could have been made differently. In our journey through medieval monastery life, we've explored the harsh realities that would have broken most modern people, the extraordinary opportunities that allowed exceptional individuals to reshape European politics, the precious knowledge that vanished into historical darkness, and the startling luxury that coexisted with systematic suffering. These weren't separate institutions, but different faces of the same complex social system, one that reveals as much about human nature as it does about medieval history and continues to offer insights into how societies organize themselves around competing principles and interests. The legacy of medieval monasticism continues to influence modern institutions in ways that often go unrecognized, from universities that preserve the scholarly traditions pioneered in monastic schools, to hospitals that continue the charitable work begun in monastery infirmaries. But perhaps the most important lesson from this exploration is the recognition that human institutions, no matter how noble their stated purposes, are always vulnerable to corruption by the very human desires for comfort, power, and status that they claim to transcend. The medieval monastery serves as both inspiration and warning, showing what human beings can achieve when they dedicate themselves to higher purposes, and what they can become when those purposes are subordinated to more immediate desires for material advantage. As our exploration of medieval monastic life draws to a close, we find ourselves contemplating contradictions that might have seemed impossible if we hadn't traced them through such careful historical detail. The same institution that subjected common monks to conditions of shocking brutality also provided the foundation for Suger's unprecedented rise from peasant to regent. The same walls that sheltered irreplaceable manuscripts for centuries also enclosed a world where abbots dined on delicacies while their brothers subsisted on thin gruel. These contradictions weren't accidents or aberrations. They were built into the very structure of medieval monasticism, reflecting broader patterns of power, hierarchy, and social organization that shaped European civilization for 1,000 years. The monastery served simultaneously as prison and opportunity, as repository and destroyer, as spiritual sanctuary and political powerhouse. Perhaps what's most remarkable about this world is how completely it has vanished. The harsh discipline that once broke so many spirits, the political networks that once shaped kingdoms, the luxury that once rivaled royal courts, all of it swept away by historical changes that the participants could never have imagined. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the rise of secular government dismantled systems that had seemed permanent and inevitable to the people who lived within them. Yet traces remain, embedded in the architecture of surviving monasteries, in the manuscripts that escaped destruction, in the legal and political traditions that evolved from medieval precedents. When we visit these ancient sites today, we walk through spaces that once contained the full spectrum of human experience, suffering and triumph, knowledge and ignorance, poverty and luxury, all existing within the same stone walls under the same religious authority. The monks who endured the harsh conditions we explored in our first segment would recognize little of the modern world, but they might understand something essential about the persistence of hierarchy, the concentration of resources among elites, and the capacity of institutions to serve multiple masters simultaneously. The abbots who lived like princes might be surprised by contemporary technology, but they would quickly grasp the mechanisms by which wealth and power continue to accumulate in the hands of those who control important institutions. As you settle into the comfort of your modern bed, with its soft mattress and warm blankets, with heat and light available at the touch of a switch, consider the vast historical distance between your reality and that of a medieval monk shivering on his straw pallet in an unheated cell. Yet consider also the persistence of human dreams and ambitions, the eternal tension between idealism and pragmatism, the ongoing challenge of creating institutions that serve their stated purposes without being corrupted by power and wealth. The monastery bells that once marked the passage of time for millions of Europeans have largely fallen silent, but the questions they raised about authority, spirituality, suffering, and luxury continue to echo through human experience. In exploring this vanished world, we've perhaps learned something not just about medieval history, but about the enduring complexities of any society that attempts to reconcile high ideals with practical necessities. Sleep well, knowing that the harsh realities of medieval monastic life belong to the past, but carrying with you an appreciation for the remarkable diversity of human experience and the persistent challenges that face any community attempting to balance spiritual aspirations with earthly needs. The stones of Monte, Cassino and Saint Denis have witnessed centuries of human struggle and achievement. Tonight they can also witness your peaceful rest.